This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 29 of Here's How. I'm continuing with interviewing a speaker from each party in the lead up to the election. The Social Democrats were established last year by 3 independent TDs. In this show, I'm talking to another of their founding members.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Now on the line, I have Anne-Marie McNally. She is a founding member of the Social Democrats and she's going to be that party's candidate in Dublin Mid West in the upcoming election. Anne-Marie McNally, when you were setting up the Social Democrats with Stephen Donnelly and Catherine Murphy and Roisin Shortall, when you were sitting around the table, did somebody come up with the line, I know what we really need in Ireland is another small left-wing party?
No, absolutely not. What we said was what Ireland needs is a party that has a more strategic long-term vision rather than 5-year electoral cycle thinking.
Well, that's a good thing to be saying, but is there a danger that you will end up just one more small left-wing party?
There's a danger of everything, but we believe the people are sovereign and they haven't yet gone and cast their votes. I think certainly the feedback we're getting is that there's a real appetite for what we're offering. So I believe that our project is obviously in its infancy, but it's one that's going to build momentum as we move forward. And I see us being quite a major force in Irish politics.
Okay. Looking at your website, it's certainly policy oriented. I can see one particular line. You say that you want to create the Irish NHS. Is that just a copy and paste?
Oh, absolutely not. No, we very fundamentally believe in universally accessible public healthcare.
No, I mean a copy and paste from the British system.
No, it's not a copy and paste in the British system, but certainly the British system, as envisaged originally, is the model that we would be working to, whereby it's proper public healthcare services that everybody can access. We feel very strongly that it should be the case that if, God forbid, yourself or your family end up sick tomorrow, that you can expect to be treated with dignity in a hospital, and it should not be dependent on how much money you have in your bank account.
That certainly sounds like something to aspire to, but there are massive vested interests within the healthcare system. How would you plan, or do you have a plan to be able to kind of defuse that political bomb and be able to create an entire new system?
Well, there are massive vested interests, all right, but certainly our primary interest is in the people who ultimately have to use the service. And in terms of diffusing a political bomb, I mean, what we're saying is it's not something that will happen overnight. We're not, talking about immediately dismantling what's there. We are talking about starting off with a community healthcare model and public health centres, community healthcare centres. And that's something that I think most people would be championing. It takes pressure off acute emergency departments. It takes pressure off GP surgeries. And essentially it works for everybody in the long run. Okay.
And I see also that you're advocating an independent anti-corruption agency. What would that look like?
Yeah, so this has been quite a big pillar of our party. You may be aware that Catherine Murphy, for example, has been involved in the establishment of the Cregan investigation into IBRC and SiteServe. Roisin Shortall certainly had plenty of experience in regards to calling for probity and accountability. So it's quite fundamental to us as a party, and what we've set out is essentially a criminal assets bureau for white-collar crime. Whereby here in Ireland we tend to have, a lot of series of roundabouts of find the problem, discuss the problem, maybe have an investigation into the problem and then let the problem go. We never seem to hold anybody accountable for what has happened or learn any mistakes or learn from the mistakes of what has happened. So what we're saying is this would be a fully independent agency with full investigation and prosecutorial powers.
Would they have powers of arrest?
They will indeed have powers of arrest. It's based on a model that was implemented in Victoria, Australia, very successfully. And within 18 months of that model having been implemented, it had recouped the cost of installation and more so.
Okay. You also talk about, you have a line, deploy personnel based on crime statistics and demographic changes within the Gardaí. Does that mean that you support closing minor rural Garda stations?
No, it doesn't at all. What it means is every year they publish a policing plan that essentially says that Garda resources will be deployed strategically based on changing demographics. We know from experience, and Catherine Murphy would have undertaken substantial research in this regard. She has a fully detailed document in relation to how Garda resources are deployed, and certainly we see that counties with much smaller populations than others have much higher Garda resources. There's actually no strategy involved in how they're deployed out, and that absolutely needs to change.
You can imagine that a lot of that deployment is based on which local TD has a bit of pull to say, I want an extra Garda, or this little station that's open for 3 or 4 hours a day in such a place, that's important to my voters.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that, but I also think there's an element of laziness in terms of the planning that happens at senior Garda level. Certainly the deployment hasn't changed substantially over years to take account of the change in demographics. So if you look at an area like Kildare, North Kildare in particular, which is essentially now a commuter belt area for Dublin, there hasn't been any consideration given to the significant rise in population out there.
It's the highest growth in population of any county.
It does, and it's got the lowest Garda per person ratio in the country.
You also talk about water charges, and I think a lot of reading through your policy documents, in a lot of cases you're kind of willing to bite the bullet and come down on one side of a policy or other and state why that is, and that's to be lauded. On water charges, what is the policy that you've adopted?
We've said very clearly that we would abolish Irish Water and we would abolish water charges.
So water would be free?
It would indeed. Okay.
That essentially means that the middle class home with a swimming pool and washing 2 cars every weekend would be subsidised through the taxes of people who are much more parsimonious. Michael McDowell said once that if you left the electricity, if electricity was free, you'd leave the lights on all night.
Yeah, and I actually think that's very condescending to people.
But it is unquestionably true that when people pay for a resource, they're more careful with it.
I think the idea that people would be wasteful for the sake of being wasteful, I think it's extremely condescending. In terms of the water charges,
it's not condescending. It's based on research that when people get feedback as to how much they're using, they're much more careful with what they use.
Yeah, I don't doubt that it absolutely impacts on people's behaviour, but I think to say that, people don't care about conserving a vital natural resource like water.
They might care, but the research is that they don't do it.
Well, I would actually question it. I mean, I don't think anybody is going to leave the taps running on just because they don't have to pay for water. I think that's
of course
the spurious argument.
They don't have, that's obviously a polemic, but there is absolutely solid research that when people get a water bill, and also depending on the way that it is metered and reported to them, they can be much more environmentally sensitive about the amount of water they use, especially given that it's as well as having a financial cost, treating water for drinking is environmentally quite costly.
Yes, I mean, Catherine Murphy has made the point quite well in recent years that Kildare County Council, for example, operate a system of telemetry whereby certain parts of the area are metered. And it allows them to see, average use. And if there's a spike in usage, it can be very easily pinpointed down to a location, and then you can investigate why that is happening, and maybe because of leaks, or maybe because somebody is filling the swimming pool. There are ways and means of dealing with that doesn't require the type of ridiculous investment in absolute super quango like Irish Water, which, as part of the research into the water metering contracts and site serve, we know is based on very fundamentally unsound foundations that we would have massive concerns about.
Sure, I accept that, but would you accept that the rightness or wrongness of metering and billing for water is a separate issue from a horrendous super quango like Irish Water?
Yes, well, I mean, we've been very clear all along in saying that we're in favour of conservation, but we believe that can happen as part of the telemetry/local authority system, whereby there would be a public entity, an Irish National Water Board, that would have the facilities to be able to pinpoint where there's areas of overusage and deal with them accordingly. But in terms of, the current regime of water charges, which let's not make the mistake of thinking that people don't pay for their water, because they absolutely do. They pay for it through the motor tax. You will know that the local government fund has been decimated since 2009 in order to fund the money that's been taken from the motor tax fund in order to fund Irish Water. I mean, basically there's a whole series of smoke and mirrors here in relation to how the funding is going into Irish Water. But to say that people don't pay for their water is disingenuous.
No, I'm not saying they don't pay for it. I'm saying that the payment should reflect the amount of use and how careful people are.
But that's my point. In terms of how Irish Water has set up, that's not going to happen. In terms of how the telemetry system in the local authorities was working, that was absolutely achievable. It just required some more strategic investment in how the motor tax fund was being deployed, and that wasn't happening. So rather than try and reform the system that kept the management of water services in local authority hands, they decided to go down the Quango route.
Fair enough. One thing that, in looking through your policy statements on your website that I thought maybe you didn't quite bite the bullet on was you have a point saying fundamentally change how we fund politics, but you don't say how. Everybody wants change. It's when it comes down to the specifics that you tend to get arguments. And for funding politics, there's basically two options. Either the taxpayer pays or wealthy donors pay. Which do you prefer?
No, sorry. In relation to that, what we meant was at the moment, the funding follows the party rather than the individual mandate. So the way the funding is set up at the moment, a lot of people would criticise the whip system for not giving TDs the freedom to stand by their beliefs. But actually the funding system is as much, if not more, a part of that problem as the whip system is. Because
so when you're saying, for example, like when a TD elected for the Labour Party, like Roisin Shortall, but then moves to a new party like the Social Democrats, her funding should move with her and not stay with the Labour Party.
Exactly, and we believe that for every TD, whether they move to the Social Democrats or whether they go independent, for whatever reason they feel the need to leave their party, and let's be honest, it happens, that the funding should go with them. Those people were elected, they were given a mandate by the people, so to disenfranchise them in such a way by pulling back on what is vital funding, they don't only lose funding, they lose staff resources, they lose office resources. So it's really unfair.
So what you're saying is this is being used as a sort of a muscle to keep people in the party.
Absolutely, to be parliamentarians with.
Okay. It's an interesting point. I haven't heard that raised before. One other point that you have on your website is that you're demanding an immediate increase in rent supplement limits as a short-term measure to prevent homelessness. If you have more money chasing the same amount of housing, isn't it a fact that you just get the same amount of, at least in the short term, you get the same amount of housing at a higher price?
Yes, listen, obviously that's why we're saying as a short-term measure, because it's not ideal, but we do believe...
If I was a landlord and I heard that, I'd put my rates up.
Well, our review is supported by Focus Ireland. If you introduce it at the same time as you introduce rent limit caps, it will be effective. And at the moment what we're seeing is, if you go along to any rental viewing at the moment, what you'll see is, and I've done it myself, you'll see people there who are on rent supplement saying, listen, I've got rent supplement of X amount, but I will personally top up to the market rent. Mm-hmm. People are putting themselves under massive pressure, bringing unsustainable debt upon themselves just to try and put a roof over their heads. It's unacceptable at the moment, and we're in a crisis situation, and unfortunately the crisis situation requires crisis measures. They may not be the ideal measures, but in terms of children sleeping in hotel rooms and hostels and in some cases backs of cars, mm-hmm. anything is preferable to that.
Okay, and that's your short-term solution. What's your long-term solution?
Well, our long-term solution is laid out quite explicitly in our manifesto in terms of investment into the housing sector, National Housing Delivery Agency to ensure 10,000 social units a year, some fiscal initiatives that would free up, for example, the space above shops.
Isn't the structural problem in Ireland the very high land prices? Ireland has the lowest population density in the European Union. Normally land prices track population density, but Ireland is at the bottom end of the population density scale and at the top end of the land price scale. Shouldn't something be done along the lines of the Kenny report, whereby people are not allowed to hoard building land?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a massive problem with that, and we have highlighted that there recently. Roisin Shortall, for example, has very publicly
Are you willing to stand up to landowners and say, no, you don't get to hold the nation's homeless to ransom?
Oh, we are indeed, and as I say, we would have issued a statement there a few months back when Alan Kelly issued a diktat to Dublin City Council telling them not to go ahead and rezone land. That there's a massive problem there in terms of the powerful vested interests, and I go back to the point I made in health. Our interest lies in terms of the citizens of this country.
Okay. If Labour and Fine Gael are a few seats short of a majority, would you be willing to join the government?
We've said very clearly all along, we're not ruling anybody in and we're not ruling anyone out. We're absolutely not prepared to be a mudguard. We have a very clear vision for a social democratic Ireland. Anybody who is prepared to try and implement a vision for a social democratic Ireland, we'd be more than willing to talk to, but at the moment we don't see that on the horizon.
Okay. And if you were in a single sentence to the people of Dublin Mid West, give them a reason to vote for you, what would that be?
In a single sentence? God,
yes.
That's hard. In a single sentence, I would say, look, this is an entirely new way of doing politics. We're laying out a vision. We're not laying out a list of promises. We're offering honest politics, not auction politics.
Anne-Marie McNally, Dublin Mid West candidate for the Social Democrats, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you so much, William. Bye-bye.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
That's almost the end of episode 29 of Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, published on the 8th of February 2016. As you can hear, this podcast is part of a series of interviews with spokespeople from each of the parties in the run-up to the election. I'm still trying to round up a few of the suspects so I can cover all parties, but I might cover other topics also. If you can think of a topic or want to suggest someone to include, and that could be yourself, then let me know. If you like the podcast, please go on iTunes and give it a nice rating or a review. Also, please like the show on Facebook. Please follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter. And of course, subscribe to the show. You can use iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast app or software. You can do all of that or get in touch with the show right from www.here'show.ie. Or you could just go out and tell all your friends about the podcast and how great it is. The next show will be uploaded shortly. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.